Hello and welcome. Before I get started with today's session, first let me say a heartfelt thanks to Amy and the Art UK team for the opportunity to connect with you all today and for supporting this project. And thanks to everyone joining me. Your attention and time is greatly appreciated. So my name is Greg Bunbury. I am a graphic designer, creative consultant, diversity and inclusion consultant, and the founder and creator of Black Outdoor Art, which I'm going to be exploring today. I'd first like to give an overview of the project with some historical context for what it seeks to achieve. From there, I'll explore some of the key learnings I've gathered along the way through notable artworks in the collection and the creatives behind them. So Black Outdoor Art is a community-driven project and initiative that uses outdoor advertising space as a platform for Black British creativity and expression. The initiative is hosted and produced in collaboration with a London-based outdoor media agency called Brotherhood Media. We commission, produce, and display artworks created by Black British artists, designers, and illustrators around themes of racism, equality, empowerment, and our lived experience here in the UK. These artworks are often collaborations between myself and the collaborators, as well as individual works developed by themselves. But each artwork is born of a discussion and a point of view as unique as the individuals behind them. Though the project came about in response to the Black Lives Matter movement, which I'll go into in more detail shortly, Black Outdoor Art seeks to reflect narratives specifically around Black British identity. Narratives that are not monolithic, but instead represent a range of perspectives. I've often said that for me, Black Outdoor Art represents the marketing of anti-racism. And this is marketing not as a function of selling, but as an act of connection. A piece of public art is unlikely to produce any structural change in and of itself, but it can create disruption. It can add to the conversation. Black Outdoor Art transforms the built environment itself into a gallery, building on art movements such as street art and situationism. Using public space in this way subverts what we expect to see in our environment and subsequently alters our relationship with our environment. This is a concept I first experienced as a child growing up in Hackney in the early 80s. And being of Caribbean heritage in a multiracial, multi-ethnic community. So right across the road from where I grew up was this mural. There's a piece of public art called The Island. It was created in 1980 by Freeform Arts Collective, which was led by arts practitioner Martin Goodrich. Some of you might be familiar with Martin's work. Now, as a kid, I didn't understand or recognize this mural as art, but I implicitly understood that this was somehow for and about my community. This work was a product of the British mural movement, which took place from around 1966 to 1985. Many muralists of this time considered their work as part of the wider community arts movement, creating projects in the service of social and political change. This kind of work is really exemplified by this piece known as the Hackney Peace Carnival. This was designed by artist Ray Walker just before his untimely death in 1984. It depicts a vibrant, joyous community carnival scene in Hackney, a scene that both reflects and projects. It's a visualization of an ideal, values shared by the very community it celebrates. For me, it also created a sense of ownership, of belonging, in a society that offered little in the way of this. As a young Black boy in an urban landscape, I came to experience what it meant to be marginalized, from police harassment, racism and violence, to negotiating an identity not quite of England's, but not quite Caribbean either. My formative experiences of racism, both overt and insidious, would go on to inform much of my adult life. So when I started my career as a commercial graphic designer, even though my work was primarily dictated by clients and employers, I kept coming back to this idea of community-focused work, specifically dealing with anti-racism. Now, perhaps this was a result of existing within marginalized spaces and structures, but I was interested in what would happen if I applied the skills that I developed as a creative and a marketer, but not in the service of brands and products, but in the service of ideas. Ideas that could help create the conditions and climate that might one day facilitate real change. So I began supplementing my commercial work with personal projects, projects that addressed social issues. Initially, I only shared these ideas online to very little response, but that work had the effect of being like a flag in the ground. And this is a really powerful idea for anyone who wants to work in a social or community art space. When you produce things that demonstrate your values, you'll likely attract collaborators and allies. For me, this came in the form of my friend's media agency, Brotherhood Media. These guys have a network of billboards and outdoor media space throughout London and the UK. Now, I've known the guys for a long time, but once I began my own personal arts activism work, they invited me to collaborate on a few projects based on their own community and social outreach projects. This billboard in particular was one of a series I designed for Brotherhood in support of the 1-year anniversary of the Grenfell fire. This particular site is in Camden Town. It's a stark typographic poster, which in its composition was very different to the commercial work I'd been doing at the time. But the more I ventured into the space, the more I began to prioritize a more minimalist approach to communication graphic design, stripping away anything unnecessary in favor of clarity and impact. And it was this project that piqued my interest in advertising space as a medium for community-focused or even politically driven art. In the last few years, we've seen such spaces like billboards given over as a medium for art, but this seemed to me to be primarily illustrative and decorative. I was interested in utilizing mass marketing tools on an ideological level in order to challenge the foundational ideas that racism was built upon. For me, racism as an ideology has been able to endure for centuries because it's been reinforced and propagated throughout our society at every level. It is born of a central idea that allowed the exploitation and bondage of a whole diaspora of people. In order to maintain this imbalance, these ideas were replicated and reinforced throughout our institutions, through education, through culture. So at its core, racism acts, for me, like a viral campaign of inequality, a set of aggressively marketed ideas centuries ago to enable the transatlantic slave trade. And it's a campaign that's been so successful that some 200 years since Britain abolished the slave trade, we're still suffering from its effects. Therefore, undoing racism must be structural and ideological also. Following the unlawful killing of Eric Garner in 2014 at the hands of a police officer in New York City, I created a poster in tribute featuring the words, "I can't breathe," 11 times. These were reportedly Eric's last words. And this poster allowed me to connect with others, not just on the basis of what I thought, but this in opposition to on the basis of what I made. So fast forward to the unlawful killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis in 2020 and the rise of Black Lives Matter. As such, many brands and organizations felt compelled to stand with the Black community on these issues. This created an opportunity for dialogue and introspection. While there was naturally a certain degree of virtue signaling from said brands and organizations, it did produce an opportunity to examine the cognitive bias and the structural racism that underpins the experience of Black and brown communities in this country. During this time, Brotherhood Media asked to reprint this poster in front of you on one of their billboards as an act of support and solidarity with the Black community. Now, I initially said no, as I was somewhat uncomfortable with the idea of a white-owned company expressing support in this way through my artwork. And this led to a long discussion between me and one of the guys where we explored where we were both coming from, our experiences, our history, our perspectives. And I expressed how I felt in that moment with everything that was going on. And it was a very candid and a very raw conversation. But we came out of that conversation with a new sense of empathy and understanding, which was really powerful. So after that discussion, instead of just reprinting the artwork from 2014, I designed a new version that connected both Eric and George Floyd, as harrowingly enough, "I Can't Breathe" were also reported as George Floyd's final words. Following the impact of this first poster, which was immense to say the least, it was clear that using a medium like this had connected with people in a profound way. I also thought there was something to how the work had been created. It felt like the transformation for me, the learned empathy, happened as a result of a discussion that preceded the work. This was the start of me moving from an output-driven work mentality to a process-driven mentality. So just to drill into this concept a little bit, if you've ever delivered a project or service-based work in any way, be that through art or design, consulting, marketing, or even tackled a brief or a project as part of your education, you've probably experienced producing output-driven work. A project or a job comes in and it requires you to produce something in particular, like a poster or a website. Therefore, the focus usually is on the delivery of that one thing, the thing that you make. But the focus is never really on all the connections that make that work possible. But I believe the transformation we deliver as creatives lies not in the thing that gets made, but in the process. This, for me, is where the real transformation happens. That's because the creative process itself is what causes us to question and analyze the problem. Work like this begins with questioning our assumptions. We're not too focused on the output because we're embracing the transformation. We're looking at the organizing principles behind the change. So after this initial poster, the agency wanted me to continue this project on an ongoing basis. But I felt it would be more impactful if the project represented dialogue from the very community I wanted to engage with. So I invited other Black British designers, illustrators, and creatives to create their own billboards to express the depth and diversity of our experience and perspective. I wanted to cultivate a rich range of styles and approaches on display, whether political or artistic, whether explorations of joy or pain. But no two posters should be alike, and each poster should present its own truth, one that should always connect with our shared experience and remain authentic. Sometimes a small amount of change we can facilitate really comes from enabling others to create their own change, or in the creation of platforms that allow others to participate in a moment or a movement. So what I'd like to do now is explore some key works from said artists in the collection and some notable experiences I've had as a result of delivering this project. The first piece of work I'd like to discuss is Black is Still Beautiful by the creative Samuel Mensah. Of Ghanaian heritage and raised in London, Samuel's professional experience and skill set spans everything from branding to art direction and design. So I approached Sam with the brief, which was to create a piece of work that reflected or commented upon his lived experience as a Black man in Britain. But what I didn't really appreciate at the time was how big a task this could appear to be. It's an immense undertaking to try and distill one experience across race, class, social status, and gender, and produce a piece of art that neatly sums it all up. But what I wanted was the opposite of that, particularly because at the time when Black Lives Matter was such a hot news topic in the media, every other day we'd see a Black celebrity or public figure being interviewed, and essentially they were asked to speak on behalf of the entire diaspora. Black culture, history, and experience is not and has never been monolithic. My experience of being Black and British is unique and as valid as Samuel's, though both may be quite different. It's so vital that as creatives and artists, we learn what we think and feel. This might seem obvious, but it really isn't when tasked with a project like this. And so creating in this way gives us an opportunity for increased introspection and analysis. So we went back and forth quite a bit on this one. And though I challenged Sam on many of his early concepts, I think it really helps crystallize his thinking. In appreciating the varied histories and experiences of Black communities, he hit upon the idea of layers, which is visualized by the torn strips of paper. It's framed by this color scheme, which evokes the Black Lives Matter identity of black and yellow, but the graphics suggest the viewer is going deeper, beyond the surface almost. It speaks to a real sense of diversity and inclusion, especially as colorism and prejudice also exist within the Black community itself. The title originated from a song lyric from the artist Dave, but in Samuel's context, this became a statement of resilience and defiance, but also one of tremendous pride. This next piece is titled Black History is British History by Genevieve Innes. Genevieve is a graduate of Central St. Martin's in graphic communication design, and her practice is built around influencing social attitudes towards groups of underrepresented communities. This piece was an extension of Genevieve's work around representing Black British history. Noticing the gaps in our historical timeline, she adapted the cultural technique of quilting to give visibility to the existence and contributions of Black people in Britain during the 17th and 19th centuries. This poster became an adaptation of the visual language in that project, an extension of the style and the composition of the quilt itself. It was designed to dismantle the single story which suggests that Black people had only arrived in Britain after the Second World War and during the Windrush period. Now, I spoke earlier about the visual economy of messaging, of a stripped down minimalist approach to communication design or even art. And this piece really encapsulates this idea. In terms of the medium, outdoor advertising space is defined by its context. So as a result, we have this concept of dwell time, which is the amount of time you might spend looking at a billboard when you're walking past it or driving past it. Typically, this can be anything from 2 to 10 seconds. So it has a very different experience and context to, say, a piece of art hanging in a gallery. Genevieve frames this approach with a minimalist treatment of names, set in a typeface called Martin, which was inspired by the placards used by protesters during the 1968 Memphis sanitation strike in the US, on which they were joined by Martin Luther King. The Martin typeface was designed by Trey Seals, a Washington-based designer and the founder of VocalType, a foundry where each typeface highlights a piece of history from a marginalized race, ethnicity, or gender. This again highlights how the way we make things, the process is as, if not more important than the output. In terms of the content, Genevieve highlights notable Black Britons from history. Many of you will be familiar with some of these names, including Olaudah Equiano, Frederick Aldrich, and Mary Prince. This next piece is by visual artist Bikani and is titled For My Sisters. It was made in response to gender and racial inequality as experienced specifically by Black women. Though the artist primarily works in abstracts with paint, you can see an example of some of her work behind me on the wall. On this project, she opted for a more direct style, perhaps more befitting the medium. Bikani was one of the artists that consistently understood the campaign with barely any input from me. And it really speaks to how important it is as creators in this space to develop and hone our perspectives. What I love about this piece is its directness and uncompromising message. It's not hiding behind a clever concept or trying to be subtle at all. It is defiantly unapologetic and speaks to an intersectional perspective of race, gender, and parity. Work like Bikani's typifies the distinction between interruption and disruption. Now, advertising itself is an interruption. It's the trailer before the movie, the ad before the YouTube video. It doesn't ask your permission, so we've become really good at ignoring it. really good at zoning it out. But when we instead aim for disruption, the unexpected, the out of place, we change the nature of what media can be. Again, we go back to this idea of connection, not selling. We've run billboards of this particular work, both in London and Bristol. As Bristol was and is such a key topic in a discussion around decolonizing public spaces, we're very keen to take the campaign there. This next piece is titled Chloe by illustrator Kingsley Nabishi, who is very accomplished and prolific in his own right. This work was created entirely by the artist. But in discussing the Black outdoor art brief with Kingsley, I was very adamant that the project should show range. The Black experience is not limited to pain and struggle, so I also wanted beautiful, joyful images alongside the more politically driven artworks. This image and the overall concept was originated by Kingsley himself, and it speaks to strength, femininity, beauty, and tradition. It's very interesting to me how much positive images of Black women feature in Kingsley's work. Another thing that struck me with Kingsley is what the work means to the artists themselves. Now, Kingsley is a very high profile artist, and it's quite typical to see his work in everything from The Guardian to The New Yorker. But when one of his first artworks went up, he messaged me that he'd gone out to see it at 10:30 at night. You see, because these billboards are located in the places that the contributors live or grew up in, it recontextualizes their relationship with that space. This is not dissimilar to street art graffiti, but what's different about the art on billboards, the art that makes up this campaign, is that they have permission. This, in a strange way, validates our experience and our place in society. It shows others that we have access, that we can create access, and it changes the narrative around our stratification. This final piece is by lettering artist and illustrator Harkaran Khalsi. Harkaran is another high-profile creative who's doing a great job of aligning her values with her work. This particular piece originated from me seeing the text "Stop and Search Your Heart" on a protester's placard during one of the Black Lives Matter marches in 2020. I discussed the idea with Harkaran, and what's noteworthy about my experiences working with her is that she's of Southeast Asian heritage. But there is a commonality, a shared experience that allowed her to bring this idea to life in such a bold and vivid way. So a collaboration like this speaks to the intersectionality of our spaces. Britain has a long history of intersection and coalition across anti-racism movements in working class communities. From the Asian youth movements in the north of England through the 70s and 80s to other marginalized working class groups and their support of the Irish liberation movement. This also leads into the concept of political Blackness. And while that term today might be considered problematic, I think the concept of anti-racist coalition is very apt for today's climate. As these issues are intersectional, the solutions must be intersectional. But at the core of Black outdoor art really are the conversations, the dialogue between myself and the artists, between the media agency that donate the space, both in London and in Bristol and in Leeds, and between myself and the creatives involved. Discussions about what this work means or represents, and the dialogue the creatives are seeking with the communities they want to reach. Also at the core of this is the idea of collaboration and unifying people around these shared experiences. This kind of socially focused work is ultimately about empathy, about connection, and ultimately about community. Since May of 2020, we've put up dozens of billboards across London, Leeds, and Bristol. I've lost count now, but it must be somewhere around 50 or 60. We've brought the campaign into schools, giving students the opportunity to respond to the brief with their own anti-racist perspectives. And again, this challenge of encapsulating very broad and nuanced ideas into singular communications. From here, I'm currently looking at models to get the campaign funded, and also developing a network based on supporting the artists involved. So I think that's going to wrap us up for today. My thanks to Amy and the Art UK team again for having me. And my thanks to all of you for letting me share this work. And I really appreciate your support. And yeah, I hope to see you out there. Thank you.